Hello, I'm going to talk to you today about the conservation treatments that I performed on a 15th century manuscript on the life of St. Augustine, which is owned by the Boston Public Library. The manuscript was unusual in that it was still bound in a binding nearly as old as the text, and both text block and binding had never been conserved or altered, with the exception of one or two historic paper repairs. Extensive fracturing to the paper underneath the hand-drawn illustrations rendered the manuscript extremely fragile and unable to be used safely without further damage, necessitating conservation. As the most extensively illustrated Vitae Augustini, still in existence, preserving the illustrations and text was one of the main priorities. Widespread use of a copper-based pigment throughout the volume meant that the paper underneath many of the illustrations was cracked and fragmentary, and the decision on how to repair these cracks was by no means simple. Factoring in the reactivity of copper-based pigments, as well as the need to preserve the aesthetics of the illustrations themselves, the chosen treatment plan would need to neither cause further long-term damage nor negatively impact the experience of future readers and scholars. This manuscript, owned by the Boston Public Library, likely originated in Speyer, Germany, based on the characteristic bull's head watermark, shown in the upper right photograph on this slide, outlined in ink. The text has been dated to between 1470 to 1485, and the binding is only a decade or two younger. The printer's waste paste down on the back board indicates that the binding was likely completed around 1494, as the leaf is from a known incunable printed in that year. As I mentioned earlier, this is the most complete Augustinian iconography known to exist, containing 116 hand-inked miniatures. The manuscript is not quite complete. Chapters 1 to 4 and 22 to 25 are missing, although this loss seems to have occurred before the text was bound. The narrative is by no means comprehensive, and most text accompanying the miniatures is brief. The manuscript was originally owned by the Order of the Hermit Friars of St. Augustine, and was almost certainly created by one of its members. The order was well known for embroidering upon the life of St. Augustine, and this may explain why the manuscript contains a number of scenes from the saint's life that are not found in other accounts. The binding is relatively intact considering its age, and has not been rebound or treated previously. The volume is bound in a quarter alum-tod pigskin over wooden boards binding. The alum-tod skin is blind tooled with floral lozenges in diamond and club shapes. There were losses in the spine material at the head and tail, as well as over the raised cords, and also some insect damage to the boards. At one point, the binding had a single clasp at the foredge, but this is now missing. The text block was sewn on 3 double cords with lightly packed sewing. Paste downs and board attachments consisted of multiple layers of parchment manuscript and paper printer's waste. The board attachments were very secure, and so the binding was still in one piece. The text block consists of 5 sections of handmade paper bifolia sewn through the fold onto double raised cords. The text consists of black ink Gothic cursive with rubrication. The illustrations, although plentiful, are fairly rudimentary, and there is almost no illumination. Executed in simple blocks of unmodulated red, blue, yellow, black, green, and ochre, these drawings are charming, lively, and humorous. The manuscript is characteristic of those produced after the popularization of the movable type printing press. Instead of parchment, the manuscript is executed on paper. Cursive script is used, rather than a formal bookhand, and rough pen and ink drawings feature prominently throughout the volume, rather than highly detailed illuminated miniatures. The primary point of concern when the Boston Public Library brought the volume to NEDCC for treatment was the extensive fracturing of the paper underneath many of these illustrations. This fracturing was presumed to be due to copper ink corrosion, since it only occurred in areas containing green pigments, and was particularly prevalent in areas where the green pigment was found on both recto and verso. The fracturing made the leaves very fragile, and there were some large losses in heavily affected areas. Even turning the pages carefully, it was observed that the fractured areas were flexing and the edges were abrading each other, so mechanical damage was occurring with every single use. If left untreated, the manuscript would immediately have to be restricted and never accessed again to avoid further damage. Conservation was therefore necessary, but the type and location of the media made treatment difficult to do safely. Copper-based pigments react negatively to moisture, heat, light, acids, and bases, so the repair method needed to minimize the object's exposure to these agents of deterioration. The aesthetics of the repairs were also a consideration, since all of the fractures ran through the illustration. Because the illustrations were on both recto and verso, the cracks in the paper could not be subtly repaired from behind. The binding was holding together fairly well, and this was largely due to the secure board attachments, unbroken sewing supports, and intact sewing around the raised double cords. However, the sewing was largely broken inside the text block, and some sections were loose. The loose sections had enlarged or torn sewing stations, and many were split or partially split along the spine fold due to mechanical wear. During use, the sections were prone to sawing against the thread, so it was clear that the text block needed to either be resewn or have the sewing strengthened to prevent further damage. Resewing would have meant disbinding the volume, but disbinding would destroy historical evidence contained in the sewing and binding structure. Instead, it was decided to reinforce the existing sewing to help stabilize the sections without removing the previous thread or disturbing the binding. After photographing the volume prior to treatment and carefully documenting its condition, the text block was surface cleaned only in areas containing no media. The surface dirt was, for the most part, heavily ingrained, and so cleaning did not appear to make much of a difference. The media was tested for friability. While most of the media was fairly stable, the carbon black pigmented areas were friable. There were cracks in the most heavily pigmented areas, and some of the black media was flaking away. These areas were consolidated with ethanol and triphenori. This consolidant was selected because it has a matte appearance when dry, and so would not negatively affect the matte appearance of the carbon-based media. The cracked areas of the paper underneath the illustrations were repaired using a fine fiber stitch technique developed by conservators at the British Library to repair tears in a copper-corroded Mercator atlas. The technique uses individual kozo fibers from blended Japanese paper to place almost invisible bridges over tears using a minute amount of dry wheat starch paste. The repair resembles stitches, hence the name, but does not actually go through the paper, and it uses an incredibly small amount of moisture to limit potential damage to the copper media. Because the repairs were nearly invisible, this treatment could also safely be employed over the illustrations without negatively changing the aesthetic impact of the drawings. To prepare the fibers, RK27 Japanese kozo paper was soaked in filtered water and then blended until the fibers separated. The fibers tended to form clumps in the blender, so the fibers were separated and combed after blending so that they were all oriented in the same direction. The combed fibers were dried and then trimmed into smaller segments approximately 5 millimeters in length. Once dry, these fibers could be stored indefinitely until needed. Prior to making repairs, the fibers were rehydrated using a drop of filtered water. The fibers were then teased apart using tweezers and a microspatula. To perform repairs, a single kozo fiber was picked up using pointed tip tweezers and trimmed with scissors to approximately 2 to 3 millimeters in length. This additional trimming was necessary to ensure that the fibers were consistent in length and also to minimize the visual impact of the repair. The fiber was then dipped into a dry wheat starch paste, and then the fiber was blotted on a ceramic tile to remove excess moisture. After blotting, the trimmed kozo fiber was applied to the fractured paper, laying the fiber across the crack. Once the fiber was aligned properly, it was very gently tamped down using a microspatula, and then it was placed underneath a bondina and blotter packet. Light pressure was applied over the mend, either with fingertip pressure or a small glass weight. Because so very little moisture is used in this repair method, the mends dried very quickly. It was necessary to work quickly, as any pause or delay in putting the fiber down once it had been dipped onto the wheat starch paste could result in the adhesive drying to the point where the mend was ineffective. Once the mends were dry, this process was repeated as necessary, spacing the kozo fiber bridges approximately 1 to 1.5 millimeters apart. The bridges were placed along the entire length of the cracks and on both recto and verso to avoid tenting. Here's a comparison of the cracks in the paper in one of the illustrations, both before and after mending. As you can see from the before photograph on the left, the cracks were causing the paper to flex, and mechanical wear from this flexion had resulted in small losses. After conservation, this seesawing motion no longer occurred and the risk of loss was minimized. The repairs are nearly invisible. When viewed from head-on, they can only be seen under a microscope. They're a little more apparent under raking light, as seen here, and even then, our photographer has boosted the image contrast so that you, the audience, can actually see the repairs. Several text leaves had large losses. The paper surrounding the losses was brittle and was at immediate risk of further loss if the pages flexed during reading or if the jagged loss edges caught on adjacent leaves. Gampi paper was chosen for the fill pieces because it was fairly lightweight yet opaque, and so would have a sympathetic appearance to the paper of the text block and not be too heavy or inflexible. Additionally, Gampi paper tends to feather with shorter fibers than kozo, so it was ideal for this particular type of fill, where the fibers needed to overlap the illustrations as little as possible. The curators were given the choice between leaving the fill paper as is, meaning that it would be a light cream color, not dissimilar to the paper of the text block, but immediately visible in the context of the illustrations, or having the fill paper toned to a sympathetic green color so that it would blend into the background of the illustration. After careful consideration and discussion, the client opted for the untoned Japanese paper fills, both to minimize the introduction of outside materials and to make it immediately obvious to the viewer that this was a repair and not part of the original material. To create the fill pieces, the outline of the loss was traced onto a piece of Melinex. A needle tool was used to score a medium-weight Japanese Gampi paper along the outlines of the loss, and then the paper was torn along this score line so that the fill piece had a lightly feathered edge. The fill piece was checked against the outline of the loss to make sure that it was neither too large nor too small, and then it was adhered over the loss area with a very, very dry wheat starch paste. Filling the losses prevented the paper from unnecessary flexing, and the feathered edges of the fill piece acted similarly to the fine fiber stitch repairs, meaning that the fragile loss edges were no longer in danger of breakage. Because only a small amount of Gampi fibers from the feathered fill pieces extended onto the illustrations, it minimized the introduction of moisture and avoided obscuring the art. Once the fracturing and losses were mended, the rest of the text block could be repaired. Mending tears and filling losses along the edges of the text block was very straightforward, requiring only local humidification to unfurl creases and folds, and basic paper repairs with Japanese paper and a dry wheat starch paste. In areas where the paper was cockled, fills and mends were shaped during drying to follow the undulation of the rest of the text block. Guarding the spine folds in situ was a little more complicated. Although the text block only contained 5 sections, adding guards could introduce additional swell at the spine and place strain on the alum-tawed skin. This could risk splitting the spine material or board attachments, so a lighter weight Japanese paper was used during guarding to reduce the amount of bulk. It was too messy and difficult to paste up the Japanese paper and then insert it between bifolia. The paper was too floppy and fragile to be pushed through with tweezers when pasted, and the paste could potentially transfer to areas where it shouldn't be. Instead, slips of Japanese kozo paper were inserted between the bifolia, the adjacent paper was masked off using Melinex, and then wheat starch paste was applied to the repair tissue. The repair tissue was then wrapped around the spine fold. The pasting out piece of Melinex was removed, and a layer of bondina was placed between the bifolia to prevent them from adhering together. The newly applied guard was dried by sandwiching the repaired area between bondina and blotter packets, and gentle pressure was applied with a bone folder until dry. This resulted in a guard that was nearly invisible, did not distort or discolor the surrounding paper, and did not require disbinding the text block in order to repair. Two of the leaves were fully detached from the text block, and so were guarded back onto the appropriate sections, as shown here on the left. To the right is a comparison of the spine folds before and after guarding. In the top photograph, you can see that the spine folds are torn and ragged, and in the bottom, after conservation, they are much more stable. Because the original sewing was not removed, many of the guards were placed individually between sewing stations to avoid placing the tissue repairs on top of the previous sewing thread. After the sections were guarded and the torn sewing stations mended, the original sewing was reinforced using a linen thread similar in appearance to the previous thread. A slightly thinner thread than the original was selected in hopes of keeping additional swell to a minimum. The sewing was reinforced around the previous thread using the same sewing stations and sewing style as the original. As the previous sewing was only loosely packed, it was possible to place the new thread between the old thread when wrapping it around the raised cords. Since the alum-tawed skin was missing over the raised cord areas, there was no need to disbind or lift any spine material to gain access to these areas. It was nevertheless a delicate process, since the volume could not safely be opened to more than 120 degrees, and inserting the needle into some of the sewing stations could be difficult. The new sewing complements the appearance of the previous sewing, but slight differences in the hue and thickness of the thread make it possible to distinguish between the two. These obvious visual differences will make it possible for scholars to differentiate between new and original materials in future studies of the volume. The previous sewing was loose and broken within the text block, unsightly and also prone to tangling. The loose thread was laid over the new sewing and adhered in place using small amounts of dry wheat starch paste. This creates the appearance of the original sewing and holds the loose threads in place, but is also easily reversible if needed. The spine material had losses, but was relatively stable otherwise. The decision was made to not fill the losses in the alum-tawed skin in order to avoid introducing new materials and adhesive unless absolutely necessary. One small split along the spine was reinforced with alum-tawed skin and Lascaux 498 HV adhesive, since there was concern that this could split further if not stabilized. Overall, this treatment successfully stabilized the text leaves and binding while minimizing visual impact of the repairs. The volume is now able to be accessed again, albeit with gentle handling, instead of strictly being off limits. The volume was also digitized after conservation and is now available worldwide on the Digital Commonwealth website at the link shown here. Before ending my talk, I want to give a few acknowledgements. From NEDCC, I'd like to thank Bex Caswell-Olson, Director of Book Conservation, and Terence D'Ambrosio, Director of Imaging Services, for their encouragement and support of this project. Nora Fund, collections photographer, who took the majority of the beautiful photographs shown in my presentation. I'd also like to thank Anne-Marie Miller of Codex Conservation for teaching me the fine fiber stitch repair technique back in 2013. I'd also like to thank Beth Prindle, Head of Special Collections, Jessica Bitely, Preservation Manager, and Jay Moschella, Manager and Curator of Rare Books of the Boston Public Library, for their enthusiastic and generous permission in letting me present this treatment to you, and for their thoughtful input on treatment decisions throughout the process. Thank you.